What would you do if your HOA poured concrete 8 feet onto your lake and told you it belonged to them? I knew something was wrong the second I smelled fresh asphalt rolling off the water before sunrise. By the time I stepped onto my porch, strangers were carving a new patio straight into my shoreline, and a woman I'd never met was barking orders like she owned the whole county. I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just watched, and wondered how far they thought they could push a man who knew exactly where every boundary on this land truly lived. The sound didn't match the hour. At that time of morning, just past 5, this part of Wyoming should have been nothing but the quiet hum of wind slipping through the pines and the soft lap of lake water against the old wooden dock. Instead, the ground trembled beneath my cabin floorboards, the kind of low, grinding vibration you feel in your ribs before your ears can make sense of it. I sat up in bed, blinking at the dim light leaking through the curtains, and caught a whiff of something sharp and chemical drifting in through the cracked window. Hot asphalt. Wet concrete. My first thought was absurd, that maybe the county was repairing the road out by the main highway. But that stretch was 8 miles from here, and sound didn't carry like this unless trouble brought it closer. I swung my legs out of bed, pulled on yesterday's jeans, and shoved my feet into the boots resting beside the nightstand. By the time I stepped into the main room, the shaking had grown stronger, rattling the old cast-iron pans hanging near the stove. Duke, my old gelding, snorted nervously from his stall outside, hooves shifting on dirt like he wasn't sure whether to trust the morning anymore. When I opened the front door, the cold air hit first, thin, sharp, the kind that tastes like snow even in late spring. Then the smell followed, thick and unmistakable. And then the sight. 2 concrete trucks idled 50 yards from my porch, their giant drums spinning like slow-motion storms. A third truck backed up toward the lakeshore, its reverse beeper echoing across the still surface of the water. Men in reflective vests moved with rehearsed purpose, guiding the chute toward a stretch of churned-up dirt that had no business being disturbed. Dust clouds hovered low, clinging to boots, jeans, and the metal sides of the machinery. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt. I had walked that shoreline nearly every day of my life. I knew every bend, every strip of cattails, every inch of that gravelly curve leading down to the water where my father used to pull in trout on late summer evenings. And now, God help me, someone was pouring concrete straight into it. I stepped off the porch, boots sinking softly into the cold morning soil. The workers barely glanced my way. One of them shot a look at another man, muttered something I couldn't hear. But it wasn't the crew that caught my eye. It was the woman standing near the front truck. She wore a tailored cream-colored coat that didn't belong anywhere near mud or machinery, and her hair, perfectly styled, not a strand out of place, was pinned back like she'd stepped out of a magazine shoot rather than a construction zone. In one hand she held a tablet, in the other a stainless steel travel mug. She pointed at the ground, giving orders to the crew with brisk confidence, her finger tracing a line that cut straight across my land, as if she were drawing borders on a map only she could see. When she turned and spotted me walking toward her, she didn't look surprised. She looked inconvenienced, like I was the unexpected delay in the schedule she had carefully planned. I stopped a few feet from her, breath fogging in the cold air. "Morning," I said, keeping my voice level. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" She gave the kind of smile people wear when they want to seem polite without meaning a word of it. "Good morning," she said crisply. "We're beginning phase 1 of the lakeside improvements." The words hit like a slap I wasn't expecting. "Improvements," I repeated. "On whose authority?" Her smile tightened, barely there. "On behalf of the Lakeshore Heights Homeowners Association. This shoreline has been designated for community beautification. You should have received the notice." I stared at her, cold air stinging my lungs, as I tried to process what she'd just said. My name's Remy Cole, I said slowly. And this is my land. All of this. My family's deed stretches back decades. There is no HOA jurisdiction here. She glanced down at her tablet, tapped the screen once, then looked back at me with a look that made my jaw tighten. Mr. Cole, the HOA has determined that this section of the lake is connected to the broader community environmental plan. We're authorized to begin work. Behind her, concrete spilled from the chute in a heavy gray stream, splattering onto the earth my grandfather had cleared by hand. The sound of it made something deep in my chest twist. You need to stop the pour, I said, stepping forward, the gravel shifting under my boots. Right now. She didn't even turn to look. She just lifted her mug to her lips and said, "You no longer have a say in this area." Something hot crawled up the back of my neck. Anger, disbelief, the sting of being dismissed on my own land. I took a breath, long and slow, the way my father used to when he didn't trust himself to speak too quickly. "This is private property," I said carefully. "Wyoming state law requires—" She waved a hand, as if brushing away something insignificant. "The HOA will handle any concerns once the project is complete. It's better for everyone if you simply adapt to the changes." Adapt. The word tasted bitter. Down by the lake, the concrete spread like a creeping stain, swallowing the dark gravel and healthy soil beneath it. A flock of geese lifted off the water in a burst of wings, startled by the machinery. The woman, Bethany I would later learn, stepped aside to answer a call, her voice bright and confident as she reported that progress was moving ahead of schedule. The workers kept going, pretending they didn't feel the weight of my stare or the wrongness of what they were doing. I stood there for a long moment, fists tight at my sides, watching my shoreline disappear beneath fresh cement. And one thought kept repeating, cold and sharp as the wind rushing off the lake. How did they think they had the right to build on land that wasn't theirs at all? The woman finally ended her call, tucking her sleek phone into the pocket of her coat. When she walked toward me, it wasn't with caution or uncertainty. It was with the steady, confident stride of someone who believed the world bent to her plans. The morning light caught the edges of her sunglasses, reflecting the trucks, the lake, and me, her expression hiding behind glass like she didn't need to see my eyes to dismiss me. "You must be Mr. Cole," she said, sounding almost pleased with herself. "I've been meaning to speak with you." I swallowed the heat rising in my chest. "Then start by telling me what you think you're doing on my shoreline." She tilted her head, smiled gentle in a way that wasn't gentle at all. "Oh, Remy, it's not your shoreline anymore. This entire section has been designated part of the Lakeshore Heights Community Improvement Project. You must have received the notices." "I didn't," I said flatly, "because my property isn't part of your HOA and never has been." She gave a small, almost sympathetic laugh. "That's a common misconception among older landowners." Older landowners. I let the phrase hang there. I was only in my 40s, but I supposed anyone without a vinyl-fenced backyard and a subscription to a home decor magazine counted as old to someone like her. She slid her tablet into view, tapping the screen with a red lacquered nail. "We've expanded the jurisdiction map. Lakeside access is now under community regulation. We're beautifying the entire shoreline for shared use." Shared use. Beautifying. Words that sounded harmless until you watched them swallow land that had been in your family for 3 generations. I kept my voice low. "You expanded nothing on my deed." Her smile grew thinner. "Remy, the HOA board approved it last month. The vote was unanimous, and frankly, this area needed an upgrade." Her eyes drifted toward my cabin, its rough timber siding weathered by decades of Wyoming winters, the metal roof gleaming dull silver under the morning sun. "We're bringing this lake up to modern standards. You should be grateful." I felt the anger twist again, slow, deep, measured, but I held it down where it belonged. "What you're doing is illegal," I said. You're pouring concrete onto private property. That is my land, not community space. That line hasn't changed in 50 years. She stepped a little closer, lowering her voice like she was speaking to a stubborn child. Mr. Cole, property lines shift with new developments. You need to adapt. The HOA is authorized to make improvements for the greater good. I stared at her. There is no world where an HOA outranks state-recorded property deeds. She tucked the tablet under her arm as if the discussion was done. Look, you can file a concern form if you'd like, but the project will continue. The trucks are already scheduled for the rest of the week, and Jake Mercer has the next phase queued. The name hit like a nail tapping the back of my mind. I'd heard it before. Developer, big talker, the kind of man who dressed like the outdoors but didn't sweat in it. Someone who saw Wyoming land only as future revenue, not as the quiet inheritance families built their lives upon. I took another step closer. Show me your permits, survey documents, boundary approvals. She raised her brows. Everything's in order. Then show me. She didn't. Instead, she crossed her arms, looking past me toward the growing slab of gray crawling across my grass. I don't need to prove anything to you. The HOA makes these decisions, not individual residents, especially not ones holding on to outdated property claims. Outdated property claims, my jaw clenched. A gust of wind brushed across the lake, carrying with it the metallic scent of wet rebar and fresh concrete. Overhead, the clouds shifted in a slow, heavy drag, dimming the sun and muting the colors of the valley. It felt like the land itself was bracing. Behind us, one of the workers shouted, and the truck's chute adjusted, redirecting more of the concrete toward the slope that had once been nothing but native grass and loose stone. The sound of it splattering into place was sickening. You need to stop this, I said quietly. Right now. Bethany shook her head once. No. You need to understand how communities work. This lake isn't just yours anymore. It belongs to all of us now. I stepped in front of her, blocking her view of the shoreline. That's where you're wrong. She gave me a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Then take it up with the board, or the county, or whoever old ranchers complain to these days. But as of this morning, this is HOA land, and the improvements aren't stopping. Her phone buzzed again. She answered it mid-turn, already walking away. Yes, Jake, everything's moving along. No, he's not a problem. Just an old landowner stuck in the past. Her voice drifted across the cold air, carried off toward the lake where the concrete spread like an infection. I looked at the trucks, the workers, the woman who treated my inheritance like a blank canvas she could redraw at will. A hollow feeling sat under my ribs. Not fear, but a kind of stunned disbelief. And beneath that disbelief, something steadier, colder, starting to rise. I turned away from the noise, eyes drifting toward the old iron boundary marker, half hidden in the tall grass. A marker I knew by heart, because my father had shown it to me when I was a boy, his hand resting firm on my shoulder as he said, "This is where our land begins, Remy, and this is where you stand your ground." The trucks rumbled on, Bethany's voice carried across the wind. The cement kept spreading, and I realized something with absolute clarity. They didn't just misunderstand the boundary. They assumed I wouldn't know how to defend it. They assumed wrong. The concrete trucks kept rumbling behind me, their engines groaning under the weight of the mix as it slid down those steel chutes and splashed into the wooden forms. The sound was steady, methodical, like a slow heartbeat belonging to something big and careless. I turned away from Bethany Reed's retreating figure and walked down the gentle slope toward the lake, boots crushing the frozen blades of last year's grass. The morning chill pressed against my skin, sharper now, as if the cold itself disapproved of what was happening. The iron boundary pin stuck out of the ground a few inches, tilted just enough to hint at its decades of exposure to Wyoming sun and snow. My father had sunk it so deep the year he rebuilt the dock that he joked it'd outlast everyone in the valley. I crouched beside it, brushing the frost away with the back of my glove. The familiar weight settled on my shoulders. Heritage, memory, responsibility, all of it mixed together like river sediment carried by time. Above me, one of the workers shouted, "Pour coming through!" The chute swung, and another wave of gray sludge washed forward, creeping toward the waterline. I straightened, pulling the old leather tape measure from my back pocket. That measure had been in my family almost as long as the pin, its brass casing worn smooth, numbers still visible thanks to my dad's habit of repainting them every few years with enamel. I hooked the curved metal end onto the boundary marker and started walking toward the fresh concrete. The tape slid out in a long hiss. 5 feet, 6, 7, 8.25. I stopped at the exact spot where my boots met the first edge of the wet concrete, shimmering with reflected sky. Steam rose gently from it, twisting in the cold like something alive. 8 feet and 3 inches. I looked at that number on the tape and felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the air around me. I'd suspected they were over the line, but seeing the measurement laid out, real and undeniable, hit deeper than anger. It hit like betrayal, like someone had walked into your home, moved your furniture, and dared you to say something about it. I let the tape retract in a metallic whir and took out my phone. Photos first. Wide angles showing the trucks. Close shots of the concrete pouring. The tape measure stretched across the frost. The iron pin. The crew's boots leaving impressions in dirt that wasn't theirs to disturb. I documented everything. Fingers steady even though my pulse hammered harder with each shutter click. The tiny snap of photos cut through the morning noise like punctuation in a sentence I'd been writing in my head for years. One about lines, boundaries, and people who thought both were optional. One of the workers, a younger guy with a patchy beard, finally looked at me too long to pretend he wasn't watching. "We're just following instructions," he said quietly. "Whose instructions?" I asked. He hesitated. "The HOA lady, the one with the tablet, said everything was signed off." I gave a short nod. "Signed off by who?" He didn't have an answer. His eyes drifted to the ground. A guilty man doesn't always look away. Sometimes it's just a man who knows he was told half a story and paid to ignore the other half. As I stepped around the fresh concrete, careful not to disturb anything that might later serve as evidence, I moved toward the section of shoreline where the earth dipped closer to the water. The lake was calm today, surface glassy and still, mirroring the pale winter sun just beginning its slow rise over the distant peaks. My breath fogged in front of me as I crouched again, snapping more photos of how the concrete formed an ugly gray tongue pushing into the natural curve of the land. This place used to be quiet. Even in conflict, it held dignity. Now it felt like someone had graffitied over a painting my grandfather once told me was perfect, because nature already did the hard work. A thought tugged at me, one that felt both cruel and necessary. This wasn't negligence. This wasn't confusion. This was entitlement. I stood slowly, letting the cold air settle around me. One of the older workers adjusted his gloves and avoided my eyes. Another cleared his throat like he wanted to say something, but didn't dare. In a nearby truck cab, a radio played faint country music, its soft twang at odds with the violence being done to the land. I walked farther down the line of disturbed soil, tracing the edge of the forming concrete with deliberate steps. More photos, more angles, more timestamps. Evidence wasn't emotional. Evidence didn't need to speak loudly. It just needed to exist, be clear, and be honest. By the time I circled back toward the cabin, I knew my next steps wouldn't be taken with the same haste as Bethany Reed's crew. The concrete would dry, the trucks would leave, But the truth underneath all of it, my truth, ran deeper than any slab they could pour over it. As I approached the porch, the morning sun finally broke through the clouds, a bright blade of gold glancing off the lake and striking the fresh concrete like accusation. Dust swirled around my boots, carried by a light wind that picked up speed as it moved inland. A lone hawk circled overhead, its cry stretching thin across the sky, as if the land itself was calling out. I paused at the top step and looked once more at what they'd done, at what they were continuing to do. The concrete trucks churned on. The crew lifted more boards, hammered them into place. The project, whatever Bethany Reed imagined it to be, was moving forward without hesitation. But so was I. Not with shouting, not with threats, not with the kind of anger that burned too fast and left only smoke. I would move with precision, with patience, with the quiet certainty of a man who knew every inch of this land better than he knew the lines on his own hands. I opened the cabin door, stepped inside, and reached for the old wooden file cabinet beneath the window. The metal drawer creaked open, revealing folders, maps, deed copies, a lifetime of records carefully kept and rarely needed. Until today. The cold morning air followed me inside as I pulled out the first map and laid it flat on the kitchen table, smoothing the edges with my palm. The paper smelled faintly of dust and age, honest smells, real smells, the kind you could trust. 8 feet and 3 inches. They thought that number would disappear under concrete. But numbers don't lie. Boundaries don't move. And I was done letting other people decide what belonged to me. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to melt the frost off the pine needles, the concrete trucks were gone. The engines faded into the distance, leaving behind a thick chemical smell that lingered over the lake like an unwanted guest. The silence that followed felt unnatural, too clean, too sudden, like a stage after the actors had hurried off, but the damage to the set remained. I stood on the porch with a cup of hot coffee warming my hands, looking out across the water. The lake usually held a soft morning blue, but today the surface reflected nothing but the gray smear of the new concrete stretching where native grass had once grown. A piece of rebar poked out like a rusted bone. The forms were still there, thin wooden ribs waiting for the next pour. The anger from earlier had settled into something heavier, a steady weight that pressed against my ribs. But beneath it was resolve, slow-burning and patient. Just as I lifted the cup to my lips, the crunch of tires on gravel drew my attention toward the front gate. A white SUV rolled up, spotless except for a thin mist of dust along the bottom panels. I recognized the HOA logo on the side. 3 pine trees above a stylized lake, the kind of branding that looked pretty on newsletters and soulless on vehicles. The SUV stopped just outside my wooden fence. A woman wearing a puffy vest and oversized sunglasses stepped out, holding a clipboard and an envelope. She walked toward the gate, posture stiff like someone determined to avoid eye contact with the world around her. "Morning," I called out, setting my cup on the railing. She startled slightly before forcing a polite smile. "Mr. Cole, I'm just delivering a notice from the Lakeshore Heights Homeowners Association." I walked to the gate but didn't open it. "I'm not part of your HOA," I said calmly. "Never have been." The woman hesitated, glanced down at her clipboard, then offered the envelope through the slats. "It's still addressed to you." I took it without touching her hand. The SUV backed away quickly, leaving a faint trail of dust rising behind it. I didn't open the envelope right away. Something in me wanted to do it on the porch, where the land could bear witness. Instead, I walked back toward the cabin, letting the breeze from the lake brush against my face. Duke lifted his head in the paddock, ears flicking curiously, sensing the change in my mood. Inside, I broke the seal. The HOA letterhead was crisp and expensive, printed in embossed ink that shimmered faintly when it caught the light. My eyes scanned the page, and a cold knot tightened in my stomach. Notice of violation. Non-compliant structures, failure to adhere to community aesthetic guidelines, fine. $250. I laughed quietly. Once dry, without humor. They were fining me for my horse paddock, for the same wooden structure that had stood in the exact same spot for 20 years. The same paddock that predated the HOA's existence by over a decade. The letter continued in that same formal, condescending tone, explaining that the fence height, wood coloration, and overall design were inconsistent with the updated residential beautification plan. Updated by who? Approved by what jurisdiction? And what gave them the right to think any of it applied to me? I set the letter on the table, smoothing it out flat with 2 fingers. The ink smelled faintly chemical, like the concrete outside. I stared at the wording, the phrasing, the smug precision of every sentence. Whoever wrote this hadn't just wanted compliance, they wanted submission. A knock hit the doorframe. I turned to see Beth Harper, my neighbor from 3 properties down, standing on the porch, her cheeks red from the cold and her blonde hair tucked beneath a knit hat. She looked uncomfortable, shifting from one foot to the other. "Remy?" she said softly. "I wasn't sure if I should come by." "You're always welcome," I replied, opening the door wider. "What's going on?" She stepped inside, fingers tightening around her phone. Have you looked at the neighborhood forum today?" I didn't answer. I didn't have accounts on any of those platforms. I'd barely gotten used to using email when needed, and even then I preferred paper. She held out her phone. "You need to see this." The screen showed a post in the Lakeshore Heights community group, written by none other than Bethany Reed. "We've encountered a challenging situation with a resident who refuses to cooperate with community improvements. Attempts to reason with him have been met with hostility. We ask for patience and support as we work to bring our lakeside area up to standard." Below the post were dozens of comments. "That old cabin guy? Figures. Some people just hate progress. He's probably breaking a ton of code violations. Good for you, Bethany. Keep the neighborhood beautiful." My jaw tightened. I handed the phone back gently. "Thanks, Beth." She looked at me with genuine worry. "Everyone's talking about you. People think you're unstable or something." She swallowed. "I just wanted you to know before it gets worse." "I appreciate it," I said. She hesitated by the door. "Is it true? Are they allowed to do what they're doing?" "No," I said simply, "but they think they can get away with it." She nodded once, then stepped outside, pulling her coat closer as the wind picked up. When the door closed, the silence inside the cabin grew thick again. I picked up the HOA letter, turning it over in my hand, feeling the embossed seal beneath my thumb. A second knock hit the door, sharper this time. I opened it to find a man in a reflective jacket, one of the construction crew, standing awkwardly on the porch. He held something out toward me, a second envelope. "This is from the board," he said, not meeting my eyes. "They told me to deliver it." When I opened it, another fine stared back at me. Notice of violation. Obstruction of community project. Project fine. $500 obstruction for standing on my own land. The man cleared his throat. "I'm just the messenger. But between you and me, things ain't right about this. We were told everything was cleared with the county." His eyes flicked toward the lake. "But I've never seen an actual permit." I held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you." He nodded once, relieved, and hurried down the path. When he was gone, I looked at the 2 envelopes on my table. 2 lies wrapped in official paper. Outside, the lake shimmered under the rising sun, as if waiting for me to decide what this land would be tomorrow. The first spark of real anger, clean and focused, settled in my chest. They wanted to bury me under fines. They wanted to turn the town against me. They wanted me to back down quietly, but I'd been raised on this land. This lake knew my footsteps. These boundaries were carved into memory, not opinion. And I wasn't done. Not even close. The afternoon settled heavy over the valley, the kind of weight that presses sound into the ground and leaves the air strangely hollow. Even the birds seemed to recognize something had shifted. No chatter from the pines, no geese skimming the water. Just quiet. A quiet thick enough to hide in. I needed that quiet. I left the HOA letters on the kitchen table where they lay, sharp white against the grain of the old timber. I didn't touch them again. Instead, I stepped back outside, closed the door behind me, and walked toward the lake, letting the wind push cool air along my collar and the faint scent of pine drift across my path. The ground felt firmer the farther I moved from the freshly poured concrete. Near the shoreline, the familiar dirt trail curved gently along the water, its edges worn smooth by decades of boots, my father's, mine, the occasional neighbors back in the old days before community guidelines replaced community itself. I stopped a few yards from the construction zone, where the lake still looked like itself. The surface was calm, darkening to a deep cobalt, where the mountains cast long shadows. My reflection wavered in the ripples, broad shoulders, flannel shirt, hands in the pockets of worn denim. A man who looked like he belonged here. A man who did belong here. For a few minutes, I just breathed. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was gathering, collecting thought, collecting resolve. My eyes drifted to the row of boulders along the shoreline, half-mossed and familiar. When I was a boy, my father had pointed to those rocks and said, "Everything from here to the dock, Remy, that's ours. It stays ours as long as we protect it." At 10 years old, I hadn't understood the burden in his voice. Now I heard it clearly. The knowledge that land wasn't just owned, it was defended, sometimes against forces too proud to check the truth. I knelt by the water and dipped my fingers in. Cold, clean, untouched, at least on this side. The breeze shifted again, carrying the faint hum of distant machinery. But out here the sound felt smaller, like it didn't dare intrude too far into what it didn't understand. I straightened, brushed dirt off my palms, and made my way back toward the cabin. Duke lifted his head from the trough, ears flicking toward me as if asking whether the world outside had calmed yet. I gave his neck a gentle rub. "We'll handle this," I murmured to him. His warm breath fogged in the thinning air, grounding me. Inside, the cabin felt different, less like a home and more like a war room. I pulled open the file cabinet drawer again. The metal runners groaned softly. Folders lined the box neatly, labeled in my father's steady handwriting. Deed, plat maps, boundary surveys, water rights, correspondence, county. I pulled out the oldest binder first, its spine cracked but holding firm. Inside were documents my grandfather had passed to my father, and my father to me. Layers of history inked onto thick, yellowing paper. The original land deed felt heavier than its weight when I lifted it, the parchment cool under my fingers. Black lettering detailed every coordinate, every right, every parcel of land recognized by the state. I read the lines slowly, tracing the boundary notations with the same familiarity as reading my own name. Nothing, absolutely nothing, involved the HOA. A gust of wind hit the cabin wall, rattling the old window pane as if reminding me not to lose the fire simmering inside. I set the deed aside and opened a flat drawer built under the table, pulling out a topographic map from the late 1960s. My father had annotated it in pencil, marking tree lines, slope grades, and where spring runoff tended to accumulate. And then, just as I reached for the next folder, my phone buzzed. Sarah Mitchell flashed across the screen. Sarah rarely called. She preferred emails, short, exact, lawyer-like. A call meant something bigger. I answered. Sarah. Her voice carried that blend of calm and concern she'd perfected over years of untangling land disputes. Remy, I heard about what's happening over there. Beth Harper called me. I sighed slowly. I figured she might. They're pouring concrete 8 feet over the line. There was a pause, papers rustling on her end. Did you measure it? 8 feet and 3 inches. Another pause. Longer. Heavier. Remy, that's not a misunderstanding. That's encroachment. I know. How far along is the project? They've started the forms. They're planning more pour next week. She exhaled sharply. I was reviewing some old county plans earlier when Beth called. Remy, that shoreline, your shoreline, was never zoned as community property. Ever. Not even before Lakeshore Heights was built. I leaned forward in my chair, heart ticking just a touch faster. You're sure? Positive, she replied. I'm sending you the PDF right now. My email dinged. I opened the attachment, a scanned copy of a 1974 water rights document. Not just land boundaries, water access allocation. My family had first priority riparian rights along the entire western curve of the lake, going back over 4 decades. The HOA had no jurisdiction, none at all. I closed the laptop slowly, letting the significance settle in my chest. The weight that had been pressing me down all morning shifted, not gone but changing shape, turning into something sharp, something useful. Sarah, I said quietly. They told me the shoreline was part of their improvement zone. That zone was illegally expanded, she replied bluntly. It's not recognized by the county, and if they issued you a violation notice, they issued me too. Well, she said, voice cooling into focus, then they've stepped over a line they can't defend. Legally, they have no authority to enforce anything on your land. I leaned back, letting the wooden chair creak beneath me. Through the window, the lake glittered under the late afternoon light, as if waiting for the next move. What do you want me to do? Sarah asked. Hold for now, I said. I'm building something they won't expect. She didn't argue. She knew me too well for that. Just, Remy, don't lose your temper. I'm not angry, I said quietly. Not anymore. Because anger burned fast. But purpose settled. Purpose stayed. After we hung up, I turned off the cabin lights and stepped outside again. The air had cooled, the sky growing orange along the ridge. I walked down the path until I reached the edge of the newly poured concrete. It was solidifying now, hardening into a scar across the land. I crouched and placed my hand on its rough surface. Cold, unwelcome, temporary. Behind me, Duke let out a low whinny as a gust of wind sent ripples across the lake. The world was going quiet again, not in defeat, but in anticipation, like the land itself was holding its breath. Because now I knew exactly what they'd done wrong, exactly what they didn't have the right to touch, and exactly what I would use to stop them. I rose slowly, dusting off my palms. Silence wasn't surrender. It was preparation. And the lake, my lake, was finally ready to speak. The next morning broke slow and gray, clouds hanging low over the water like a heavy tarp. A fine mist drifted across the lake's surface, soft as breath, blurring the far tree line into a watercolor smear. It was the kind of morning where sound carried differently, muted, stretched, like the world was listening rather than speaking. That suited me just fine. I set a pot of coffee on the old iron stove, its familiar crackle warming the cabin. While it brewed, I laid the deed, the water rights file, and the 1974 maps across the table, each page flattening into place under the gentle weight of smooth stones I'd collected over the years. The papers looked fragile, thin, yellowed, some edges softened by time, but every line they carried held more authority than anything Bethany Reed's HOA had ever signed. The rain began lightly, tapping against the cabin roof with a steady rhythm. Duke nickered from the paddock, unsettled by the weather, or maybe by the tension he sensed in me. Animals always knew. I grabbed my jacket from its hook near the door, slid the deed carefully into a plastic folder, then paused as another sound cut through the soft pattering, tires crunching on the gravel again. Only this time it wasn't an HOA car. It was a black pickup with chrome trim, too polished for ranch work, too loud for someone trying not to draw attention. It rolled up the drive, stopping near the edge of the yard. A man around my age, maybe a little younger, stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, hair styled like he'd spent more time in front of a mirror than in the Wyoming wind. Jake Mercer, developer, smooth talker, the kind of man who believed he could build his way into respect. He stood for a moment, hands on his hips, surveying the lake like he was evaluating property he already owned. The rain wet his jacket, but he didn't seem bothered. Men like him rarely noticed the weather, unless it ruined their shoes. I opened the door and stepped onto the porch. "If you're looking for the HOA," I said, "they don't live here." Jake gave me a grin that felt like a business card, bright, confident, and empty. "Morning, Remy. Thought we should have a little neighborly chat." My jaw tightened. "About what?" He walked closer, boots leaving shallow prints in the damp earth. "Look, man," he said, lowering his voice like we were sharing a secret. "I get it. Change is uncomfortable. But this project? It's good for everyone. Raises property value, brings in investment, modernizes the area." "Modernizes," I repeated, "by building on land that isn't yours." He chuckled softly. "The HOA assured me everything was above board." "They lied," he shrugged. "Then take it up with them. But do yourself a favor, don't fight this. You'll burn time and money, and in the end, progress moves on with or without your permission." "That's what you call this?" I asked. "Progress?" He spread his hands as if presenting a deal. "We're giving this lake potential. You could benefit too. Sell part of your frontage, just the shoreline, and you'd retire very comfortably. Meanwhile, I finish the job, the HOA gets its community space, and nobody has to drag lawyers into this." I stared at him. "You think this is about money?" "Everything is," he said lightly. For a second, the only sound was the rain, falling harder now, hissing against the concrete they'd poured the day before. Jake glanced toward it, then back at me. "You've got a nice place here, Remy," he said. "But it's old, outdated. People want something cleaner, more accessible, fresh. The HOA is trying to help you, whether you see it or not." I stepped down off the porch, closing the distance between us. "Jake, I don't need anyone to modernize my land. I don't need anyone to save my shoreline. And I sure as hell don't need anyone to tell me what belongs to me." He chuckled again, but the sound was tighter this time. "You're making a mistake." "No," I said quietly. "You are." He opened his mouth, but something in my eyes must have changed his mind. He walked back to his truck without another word. The door slammed, the engine roared, and he drove off, tires spitting gravel in protest. When the sound faded, I turned toward the lake. The rain slicked the hardened concrete, turning it a darker gray, almost black. It looked wrong against the natural landscape, out of place, intrusive, stubborn. But it also revealed every flaw: uneven flow lines, exposed aggregate, places where the form boards bowed outward from sloppy placement. Sloppy work made good evidence. I walked the perimeter slowly, documenting everything with my camera. The rain made the photos clearer, the details bolder. Water droplets clung to rebar. Mud collected along the edge where they'd misjudged the slope. The boundary pin, half buried in grass, now glimmered wet, unmistakable in its purpose. I continued up the slope, past the cabin, to the old oak that stood like a sentinel near the ridge. Its branches reached wide, leaves trembling under the rainstorm. Beneath the roots, hidden under a stone my father placed there decades ago, lay a metal lockbox. I lifted the stone, unlatched the box, and removed a sealed folder wrapped in wax paper. My father's handwriting marked the top. Boundary Certification, 1984. I carried it back into the cabin, wiped off the rain, and opened the folder. Inside were photographs, notes, signatures, and my father's careful documentation of every property marker from the year he last renewed the boundary survey. Back then, the county required physical inspections, and my father had taken the job seriously. He was a practical man, no nonsense, no shortcuts, and he believed in keeping a record that could outlive misunderstanding or deliberate ignorance. I spread the papers across the table next to the 1974 documents. The more the pages overlapped, the clearer the truth became. The HOA's expansion wasn't supported by anything. No legal description, no county approval, no rights tied to the shoreline whatsoever. The rain intensified outside, wind pushing it sideways against the windows. Duke stomped once in the paddock, restless. Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, echoing against the mountains. I opened my laptop, logged into the county's GIS portal, and pulled up the digital boundary map. Coordinates appeared as bright yellow points on the screen. I cross-checked each one with my father's notes, the deed, and the water rights file. Every match lined up perfectly. The HOA had nothing. Sarah's words from yesterday echoed in my mind. If they issued you a violation, they've stepped into legal territory they can't defend. I typed an email to her, attaching all the files and photographs. Then I wrote one final line. Prepare the case. I'm ready. I hit send. The storm outside calmed a little, as if the valley was catching its breath. The rain softened into a steady patter on the cabin roof. I walked to the window and looked out over the lake. Mist curled along the surface, curling around the concrete slab like nature itself was deciding whether to tolerate it. I took a long breath, then whispered into the quiet space between the storm and the earth. You picked the wrong lake, Bethany. Because I knew the numbers, I knew the boundaries, and I knew the law better than the woman who thought she could paint lines over history. Paper didn't shout. Paper didn't threaten. Paper didn't posture on social media. Paper simply waited for its moment. And that moment was coming. The storm passed in the early hours before dawn, leaving the air unnaturally still, sharp, washed clean, and cold enough to sting the lungs. When I stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaked under my boots, wet from the night's rain. Thin wisps of fog clung low above the ground, drifting across the grass like smoke rolling off a battlefield no one wanted to talk about. The lake was still. Too still. A mirror of gray sky and bruised clouds. And the concrete slab the HOA had poured the day before? Now it looked worse. Darker, streaked from the rain, and beginning to pull away from the forms where they'd rushed the job. Imperfection revealed itself under pressure. That was something my father always used to say. The quiet broke with the crunch of gravel down the driveway, a county vehicle. Not HOA, not a contractor, not a neighbor. County. A white SUV rolled to a stop near the front fence. The logo on the side, Teton County Survey and Land Use, gleamed in the early light. A man I recognized climbed out, jacket zipped to his chin, clipboard under his arm. His name was Travis Duncan, one of the field surveyors. Good man, steady hand, honest, the kind of county staffer who didn't bend easily, no matter who tried. "Morning, Remy," he called as he walked toward the gate. "Heard there's something out here you wanted eyes on." "Morning, Travis," I replied, unhooking the old iron latch. "Appreciate you coming." I got a call from Sarah, he said. Sounded like something's not adding up. I let out a slow breath. Not adding up is a polite way of putting it. He stepped through the gate and followed me down the path toward the lake. The fog drifted aside as we walked, revealing the hard line of the concrete pad jutting into the earth like a wound. Travis stopped, blinked, whistled under his breath. Good Lord, he murmured. They really poured over the line. 8 feet and 3 inches, I said. Measured it myself. He crouched, running his gloved hand along the edge of the slab. Then he stood again, scanning the shoreline. Remy, this isn't even close to ambiguous. That pin marker behind the boulder, that's original placement. Haven't seen one of those in decades. My father said it, I said quietly. He nodded. Then it's solid. Travis pulled a long orange ribbon from his pocket and tied it around the boundary pin, marking it clearly. Then he walked back and forth along the slab, taking photos, jotting notes, and shaking his head every so often. You know they didn't file a request with the county, right? He said. I checked before driving out. I figured, I replied. And no permit, he added. I figured that too. He looked at me, expression tightening. You want this escalated? I want it documented, I said. Everything. Every inch. Every angle. Every violation. Travis nodded once, slow, deliberate. Then he got to work. For the next 40 minutes, the only sounds were the soft clicking of his camera, the scribble of his pen, and the faint lapping of the lake water against the rocks. The fog thinned further, drifting upward, revealing the mountains washed in pale gold. When he finished, he slipped his tools back into his pack. I'll get this submitted immediately. Sarah will get a copy, and… Remy? Yeah? This isn't usual. I've seen HOA overreach before, but what they did here, this is blatant. And the developer they're working with, this Mercer guy, he's been sniffing around several lakeside properties recently. Aggressive pitches, more aggressive assumptions. I've noticed, I said. Travis hesitated a moment before adding softly, just make sure you watch your back. I nodded. I always do. He gave a short nod, then climbed back into his vehicle and headed off down the gravel road. The silence returned. Only now it wasn't the same silence I felt the day before. It was anticipation. A few hours later, as the afternoon sun began to burn away the last of the storm clouds, I received a text from Sarah. County wants a meeting today. Bring everything. 3 p.m. Don't be late. It wasn't a suggestion. I gathered the deed, the surveys, the water rights, the maps, and the photos, old and new, stacking them into a thick binder that felt heavier than any weapon I'd ever held. Then I drove into town, the dirt road kicking dust behind me like a tale of determination. The county offices sat in a blocky gray building near the courthouse square. Inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed quietly, the smell of old carpet and cold coffee lingering in the halls. I followed the receptionist's directions to a small conference room. Sarah was already there, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back, reading over Travis's report. When she saw me, she closed the folder and straightened. You ready? She asked. As I'll ever be. The door opened, and in walked 3 county officials, a land use administrator, a zoning manager, and a compliance officer. Behind them, to my surprise, walked a 4th person, Bethany Reed. She looked polished, confident, and irritated to even be here. Her heels clicked sharply against the linoleum floor. Her eyes flicked to me, then to the stack of documents I'd brought, and something in her jaw tightened. She took a seat without being invited. The meeting began. The land use administrator, an older man named Harold Collins, adjusted his glasses and looked at the room. We're here to review a potential encroachment and violation of county code regarding shoreline development. Bethany crossed her legs and smiled tightly. This is a misunderstanding. The HOA will determine that, Harold cut in, voice steady but firm. Sarah leaned forward. Then let's begin with Exhibit A. She slid the deed across the table. I watched the room closely. The officials reviewed the document with the kind of quiet attention that always preceded a decision. When they turned to the maps, the photos, the boundary pin, the water rights, their expressions shifted. Subtle, but unmistakable. Then, finally, Sarah opened the last folder. Before any further discussion, she said, there's one more thing the board should be aware of. She looked at me. I met her eyes, then reached into the binder and pulled out a laminated identification card. Harold squinted. Mr. Cole, what is that? I set it gently on the table. Teton County Surveyor. Official certification issued 2012. Expired 2020 name. Remington Cole. The room went still. The zoning manager looked from the card to me, brows raised. You're a former county surveyor? I nodded. 8 years. Silence stretched. Heavy, meaningful. Bethany's face drained of color. She stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time, her confidence wobbling under the weight of something she should have considered before pouring concrete onto land she didn't understand. She hadn't asked who I was. She hadn't cared, and now that mistake was sitting across the table from her. Harold cleared his throat. Given Mr. Cole's history with the county and his familiarity with these boundaries, his claim carries significant weight. And combining that with the documentation provided, this situation is not only concerning, it appears egregious. Bethany opened her mouth. Now hold on. No, Harold said, raising a hand. You hold on. Her jaw snapped shut. Harold exhaled, rubbing his temples. We will be initiating a full investigation into this unauthorized construction. Effective immediately. All work is to cease. Bethany looked like she'd swallowed a mouthful of gravel. Sarah allowed herself the slightest smile. I sat back in my chair, calm, not triumphant, not even relieved, just steady. Exactly how I felt when restoring a fence line after a storm. Because truth didn't need theatrics. Truth only needed daylight. And today, it had finally found its way in. The parking lot outside the county building was blinding in the afternoon sun. A wide concrete plain that smelled faintly of dust, warm metal, and the pine trees that ringed the town. I stepped out into the heat, binder tucked under my arm, the weight of the meeting still settling into my bones. My truck sat where I'd left it, dust clinging to its fenders like a familiar coat. But something in the air had changed. Something heavy, charged, expectant. I felt it before I heard the footsteps. Mr. Cole. The voice was clipped, feminine, and carrying the edge of someone used to being obeyed. I turned to see Bethany Reed striding toward me across the lot, her heels ticking against the pavement like impatient clock hands. The sun glared off her sunglasses, hiding her eyes, but the tension in her jaw said enough. Do you have any idea, she began, what you've just done? I paused by my driver's side door, studying her. She looked smaller out here, fewer admirers, fewer HOA board members, no clipboard, no concrete crew behind her to make her feel important. Just a woman standing too straight, holding too tight to a confidence that was starting to crack. What I've done, I said, is tell the truth. That was an ambush, she hissed. Using your old position like that. That wasn't an ambush, I replied calmly. That was context. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. She pulled off her sunglasses, and for the first time I saw what she'd been hiding behind them. Fear. Fear wrapped in anger, but fear all the same. You think you've won something, she said quietly. But you don't know who you're fighting. Oh, I do, I said. I'm fighting someone who thinks influence is stronger than law. She opened her mouth, but stopped when another engine rolled into the lot. A Silver County truck eased into a nearby spot. Sheriff Marcus Hale stepped out, his hat low over his brow, badge glinting at his chest. Built like a ranch gate, solid, unyielding, dependable. Bethany froze. Marcus didn't approach her. He approached me. "Remy," he said, extending a hand. "Heard you stirred up something worth looking at." "Not my intention," I said, shaking his hand. He eyed Bethany briefly, politely, without warmth. "Ma'am." She swallowed. "Sheriff?" "County looped me in," Marcus said, turning his attention back to me. "Land use violations fall under civil enforcement, but if there's additional intimidation or tampering with markers, that becomes criminal." His voice didn't rise or fall, just steady. "Mind if I take a walk down to your shoreline later today?" "Anytime," I said. Bethany stepped forward slightly. "Sheriff Hale, this is a misunderstanding." Marcus didn't even blink. "If it is, it'll come out clean. If it's not—" He let the sentence drift, unfinished but loud. Bethany's voice tightened. "I'm the elected HOA president." Marcus tipped his hat. "And I'm the elected sheriff. Only one of those positions enforces state statute." Nothing in his tone was cruel. It was simply factual, like a boundary line on a county map. Bethany turned abruptly and walked to her car, shoulders stiff, keys jangling with more force than necessary. When she drove away, dust scattered behind her like a trail of shaken pride. Marcus exhaled, long and slow. "She's been pushing hard all over this county. Thought she'd finally hit someone who wouldn't push back." I shut the truck door behind me. "She hit the wrong property this time." His eyes sharpened. "She hit the wrong man." He headed back to his vehicle, pausing only to add, "I'll be at your place by sundown. Don't worry, we'll handle this by the book." The engine of his truck faded down the road as I turned toward home. The sun was dipping behind the western ridge when Marcus arrived that evening. Shadows stretched long across the ranch, and the lake reflected a deep bronze glow, calm, quiet, deceptively peaceful. Ranger whinnied at the sheriff's truck rolling in. Duke stood by the fence, ears forward, watching. Marcus walked the property with me, boots sinking slightly in the damp earth. I guided him along the old cedar posts, down the slope toward the boulder that marked the corner pin. Halfway there, he slowed. "This is untouched land," he said softly. "Unaltered. These old markers, they're rare." "They're honest," I said. He crouched and studied the pin. "It's still in original placement." Then he turned to the slab. "And that is not." The concrete gleamed pale in the low light, its edges sharp and ugly against the natural line of the shore. One section had already begun to fracture, a thin seam near the middle where rushed curing had betrayed itself. Marcus pulled out his county tablet and started taking photos. "I'll file a report with zoning and county legal. Unpermitted construction, willful boundary encroachment, probable misuse of HOA authority. They'll add it to the investigation." He stood again, brushing dirt from his hands. "You know," he said after a moment, "a lot of folks think justice is some big dramatic thing. Handcuffs, courtroom shouting, newspaper headlines. But more often than not," he gestured around, at the lake, the pin, the boulder, the slab. "It's this, quiet, technical, unshakable." I nodded. "Lines don't lie." "No," he agreed. "People do." A breeze rolled off the water then, cool and carrying the scent of pine sap and wet earth. Drifting across the surface was the faint ripple of a trout breaking the still water, a small, simple reminder that the lake didn't care about egos or HOA boards or political connections. It only cared about truth. Marcus tucked the tablet back into his vest. "There'll be a formal cease order notice delivered tomorrow morning." "Bethany won't like that." "No," he said, "but the law isn't about what she likes." He left as the last edge of sunset faded, leaving the ranch wrapped in blue twilight. The next morning came with the sound of tires crunching down my driveway. Not frantic like the construction trucks, not arrogant like Bethany's SUV. This was steady, official, a county sedan. A woman stepped out. Clipboard, badge, and a windbreaker embroidered with county building compliance. Her name tag read, Ellie Parker. "Mr. Cole?" she asked as she approached. "Yes, ma'am." She handed me a folded notice stamped with a red seal. "Effective immediately. All construction on the disputed area is suspended pending full investigation and hearing. Violation penalties to be determined." She looked toward the lake and frowned. "I've reviewed the file already. Honestly, this one's not even close." "I know," I said. "You documented everything," she added. "Most people don't." "Paper remembers," I replied. She smiled faintly. "That it does." Ellie took a few more notes and left, dust swirling behind her sedan. I stood there for a while, reading the notice again even though I didn't need to. My hands felt steady. My breath came easy. The land around me, grass stirring, horses shifting, water lapping softly against the stones, felt like it was finally standing with me instead of under threat. The law had drawn its line, and it matched mine perfectly. The concrete, the noise, the intimidation, the letters, the gossip, those were temporary. But boundaries? Boundaries were forever. And for the first time since the trucks arrived, the lake felt quiet again. Quiet in the way a held breath is quiet, right before the moment everything changes. The morning of the hearing came cold and bright, the kind of Wyoming morning that carried a sharpness in the air, like the land itself was paying attention. Frost clung to the edges of the fence posts, glimmering under the pale sun. My boots crunched over the frozen ground as I crossed the yard, saddlebag in hand, packed not with rope or tools, but paperwork, maps, deeds, surveys, photographs, the ammunition of a different kind of fight. Inside the cabin, the wood stove crackled low, warming the room just enough to take the bite out of the air. I poured myself a cup of coffee from the enamel pot on the stove and set it down next to the manila folder marked Exhibits AG. Everything was in order, cross-referenced and dated, because once truth showed up wearing proper documentation, no one, not Bethany, not her developer friend, not the HOA board she commanded, could shove it back into the shadows again. My truck's engine turned over with a familiar growl. The road to town wound along the lake, the water still and glassy beside me, as if waiting for a verdict of its own. Duke and Ranger watched from the paddock as I passed. Two sets of ears pointed toward me, steady as always. They didn't understand hearings or encroachment or unpermitted construction, but they recognized purpose in the way a horse does. Animals know when a man is riding out to settle something. The county building rose ahead, brick and glass catching the sun. Dozens of cars already filled the lot. Folks in their jackets and beanies stepped inside, talking quietly. Word had spread. It always did in a small place like this. Some came out of curiosity, some out of loyalty. Some just wanted to see an HOA president explain why she'd poured concrete onto her neighbor's land. I walked through the doors and was immediately greeted by a familiar voice. "Remy." Sarah Mitchell stood at the check-in desk, hair pulled back, coat dusted with cold air. She held a folder almost identical to mine. "You ready?" she asked. "As ready as the law can make a man," I said. A corner of her mouth lifted. "Good, because they're not going to be." We stepped into the hearing room, and every conversation dipped by a fraction. Rows of chairs faced a long wooden table where the county board sat. Behind another table on the left, Bethany Reed was already seated beside her attorney, a tall man in a dark suit whose confidence radiated like someone used to winning by volume rather than substance. Bethany herself looked smaller than usual. Not physically, just less inflated. The certainty she wielded like a weapon wasn't sitting as squarely on her shoulders today. She glanced at me briefly, then quickly away. I took my seat at the table opposite her, Sarah beside me. The weight of the paperwork in my bag seemed heavier than before. Not burdensome, grounding. The chairman lifted his gavel and tapped it once. This hearing is now in session. Silence settled thick and complete. Case on the docket: property encroachment, unpermitted construction, and misuse of HOA authority involving parties. Remy Cole and the Evergreen Ridge Homeowners Association, represented by its president, Ms. Bethany Reed. Bethany's attorney stood, buttoning his suit jacket with deliberate precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the board, this is a simple misunderstanding blown out of proportion. My client, but he didn't finish his sentence, because the chairman raised his hand, not rudely, just decisively. Mr. Hale has already filed a preliminary enforcement report regarding a violation of county code. We're not here today to debate impressions or emotions. We're here to review evidence. The attorney blinked, but composed himself. Of course. The chairman gestured toward me. Mr. Cole, you may present. I rose slowly, the room shifting to stillness around me. I reached into my bag and pulled out the large envelope with reinforced corners. The old deed inside was fragile, but today it needed to be seen. I laid it gently on the table, hands steady. This land, I began, has belonged to my family since 1970. Its boundaries have been surveyed, confirmed, and recorded. Those records haven't changed. The land hasn't changed. Only someone's assumption of power has. I opened the deed, spreading it flat. Gasps rippled through the room, not because the paper was old, but because they saw the stamped seal in its corner. Exhibit A, I said. Original deed, signed, certified, and filed. I reached again into my bag and lifted the next item, a rolled-up survey map. I unfastened the band and let it unfurl across the table. Acres of lines, measurements, coordinates, ink from 40 years ago brought back into the light. Exhibit B, I continued. Original survey, conducted and verified by the county surveyor's office. The chairman adjusted his glasses, leaning forward. And Exhibit C, I said, sliding a printed map across the table, is the current county GIS overlay, reflecting unchanged boundaries. Then I placed the final set of images, printed photographs, time-stamped, beside the maps. The concrete slab, the iron pins, the 8-foot encroachment. The truth was right there, in black and white, unmoving, indisputable. Bethany's attorney stood again, but the words that left him were thinner now, less certain. These documents don't prove intent. At most, they suggest they prove the boundary, Sarah cut in, voice calm but firm. And the boundary is the law. The chairman nodded. Agreed. The attorney's face tightened. The chairman turned to Bethany. Miss Reed, did you consult the county before building on the disputed area? She hesitated. The contractors assured me that wasn't the question. Her throat bobbed. No. And did you obtain the required permit for ground-level construction within 50 feet of a lake shoreline? She swallowed again. No. And were you aware Mr. Cole's property predates the HOA boundary map by nearly 5 decades? Her jaw tightened. No. Each answer dripped into the silence like stones sinking in water. Then the chairman asked the question that sealed it. Ms. Reed, why did you tell your HOA board that the land was community-owned? Her eyes darted toward her attorney. For a moment she seemed to shrink inside her own posture. Her voice came out thin. I misinterpreted the diagrams. The board members exchanged a look. A long, heavy moment stretched between the tables. Then the chairman turned toward me. Mr. Cole, he said, Is there anything further you wish to add? I looked down at the deed, at the survey, at the photographs, the evidence my grandfather never imagined would be needed someday. Then I lifted my eyes. This lake, I said quietly, was entrusted to my family long before any HOA existed. My grandfather protected it. My father respected it. I'm doing the same. Boundaries matter, not because they keep people apart, but because they keep things honest. The room settled into stillness again, like the lake right before sunrise. The chairman leaned back, exhaling through his nose. The board finds the evidence clear. The HOA has committed an unpermitted encroachment on private property. The structure must be removed within 30 days. Fines will be issued. Further, misuse of HOA authority has been noted and will be reviewed. Bethany's face went pale. Her hands trembled where they clutched her folder. She stared forward, not at me, not at the board, just forward, as if trying to outrun the verdict settling around her. But there was nowhere left to run. The hearing room buzzed with murmurs as the gavel struck once more, sharp and absolute. Decision made, line drawn, truth upheld. And as I gathered my papers, sliding the deed back into its envelope, I felt the weight of something lift, not just from my shoulders, but from the land itself, as though the ranch had been holding its breath alongside me. Now it could breathe again. Outside, sunlight hit the lake in a bright sweep of gold, like it was welcoming me home. The drive back along the shoreline felt different this time, lighter somehow, like the road itself had stretched out in relief. The wind off the water wasn't biting anymore. It brushed against my face like something familiar, something earned. The cottonwoods by the fence line shivered softly, leaves catching the light in quick flashes. Even the gravel under my tires seemed quieter, like the land had decided the noise was finally over. When I pulled into the yard, Duke lifted his head from the hay bale, ears swiveling toward me. Ranger whinnied from the far corner of the paddock, pacing the fence for a moment before settling. Animals always sensed the end of a storm before the sky cleared. Maybe they'd known all along that this fight wasn't mine alone. It belonged to the ranch too. I stepped out of the truck and stood there for a while, letting my boots settle into the dirt that had held my family's footsteps for generations. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called, low and echoing, drifting across the water like a closing curtain on the last act of a long, unwanted play. It wasn't over yet. Not completely. There was still work to be done. By noon the next morning, the demolition crew rolled in. Their trucks were large, their equipment loud, but none of that bothered me. Not today. These machines weren't here to take something from me. They were here to return something that never should have been touched. The foreman hopped down from his cab, wiping his hands on a rag. He looked at the concrete slab stretching across my shoreline and let out a slow whistle. "This was put in fast," he said, "and wrong." "Most things built on lies are," I replied. He gave me a nod that said he understood more than he let on, and motioned to his crew. Within minutes, the jackhammers started up, pounding rhythmically against the hardened surface. Shards of concrete broke loose, scattering like brittle shells across the dirt. Dust rose into the air, catching sunlight in suspended flecks, drifting out over the lake before the breeze carried it away. I watched from the porch, arms folded across my chest. Every crack of the jackhammer felt like a knot loosening, an insult undone, a boundary restored. It wasn't triumph I felt, not revenge, just balance slowly returning. By evening, the patio was gone, not reduced or trimmed or reshaped, gone. The earth beneath it looked raw and exposed, but honest. The foreman walked up to hand me a final document. "Restoration complete," he said, "to original grade." I signed without hesitation. Paperwork had started this war, and it was only right that paperwork ended it. He tipped his hat and drove off, the fading hum of his engine leaving the ranch in soft quiet again. As twilight fell, I walked down to the newly cleared shoreline. My boots sank slightly into the disturbed soil, still cool from the shadows creeping in. The lake mirrored the sky, deep blue, streaked with orange, calm as a held breath finally released. I could almost picture my grandfather standing where I stood now, nodding once, the way he always did when something had been set right. Behind me, the first of the consequences unfolded quietly. Bethany Reed resigned from the HOA presidency 3 days after the hearing. No announcement, no speech, just a terse email forwarded through the neighborhood chain, stripped of her usual flair. Rumor had it board members demanded accountability. Others said the county had suggested stepping down. Maybe it was both. Jake Mercer received a notice of investigation from the County Development Office. Failure to obtain permits, involvement in unauthorized work, allegations of coercion toward residents. Developers rarely feared moral justice, but legal justice was another matter. As for the HOA itself, the board voted to rescind every violation they'd sent me and issued a written apology. Short, formal, but honest. They also passed a motion requiring third-party legal review for any future enforcement action. Apparently, my case had shaken more than just a shoreline, but the biggest consequence was quieter, slower, and deeper. Neighbors who'd once avoided meeting my eyes now waved when I rode down the county road. Bethany's little circle of loyalists stopped whispering at grocery aisles. People returned to themselves, humble, cautious, awake. One evening, as I walked Duke along the water, Beth from the cabin 2 lots over stepped onto her porch. "Remy," she called gently, "I'm glad things worked out. For you and for all of us." I nodded. Some things just take time to settle. "But you made sure they settled right," she said. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Days stretched into weeks. The grass slowly reclaimed the ground where the concrete had been. Wildflowers sprouted again. Purple asters, golden pea, brushstrokes of color against the earth. It looked almost like it did before the trucks came, before the shouting, before the letters meant to scare me quiet. And maybe that was the real victory. Not the fines, not the hearing, not the apologies, but the quiet. The kind that settles into a place when truth has finally finished its work. One late summer afternoon, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, listening to the lake lap gently against the stones. Duke grazed nearby, his coat catching the last light. Ranger flicked his tail lazily at flies. Everything felt as it should be, untouched, steady, honest. I pulled the deed from its envelope and held it in the warm air. The paper had yellowed over the years, edges softening, ink fading in old places. But the lines, the boundaries, remained sharp. Just like justice, just like the land that carried it. And as the sun dipped low over my lake, stretching gold across the still water, I realized something simple and true. The loudest people were never the ones who owned the earth they stood on. The ones who knew it, who understood it, respected it, were the ones who kept it safe. Bethany had tried to take something that didn't belong to her. I had simply reminded the land who it belonged to. And the lake stayed quiet. Sometimes standing your ground is quieter than folks expect, but it still matters just the same. If you've ever had to fight for what's yours, drop a justice in the comments so we know we're not alone out here. And if you'd like to hear more stories about land, grit, and doing what's right, I'd be glad to have you subscribe and stick around.